Really interesting.
It is.
Yes, it is. I like it.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the Maccabees. This is the intertestamental period. This period in history sets the backdrop for the New Testament. And a lot of us read Bibles in black and white, okay? Of course, we got red letter editions. But if you want to see it in living color, you have to know the history. You have to know the history that those people in the New Testament knew, that didn't have to be repeated in the New Testament because everyone knew it. And you have to look at original languages too. Anyway, Jewish background of the Bible, the Maccabees, references for this. First and second Maccabees are primary references, with first Maccabees considered to be historically accurate, second Maccabees considered pretty accurate with probably some embellishment. Josephus mentions them, and I think the Dead Sea Scrolls have something to do with it too. Other sources I've used for this, David Calhoun, that legendary church history teacher at Covenant Seminary in St. Louis from back in the old days. He had a course online called New Testament History. Someone downloaded all those courses to me a long time ago on a DVD. His course has been removed, and it's now someone else doing New Testament history and theology the last time I looked. But I do have this on Dropbox if anyone wants to get in and get these. There are study guides and there are the lectures. This particular course does not have transcripts like most of the Covenant courses do, or at least most of Calhoun's courses do. His two church history courses actually have pretty accurate transcripts, almost word for word. This doesn't. Anyway, I've also used Edward Andrews, the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasty between Malachi and Matthew. I've used H.A. Ironside, the 400 Silent Years. There are web pages on the internet. There are other books. I've got a huge one at home, like 600 something pages, and I've got another one coming in from Amazon, I think, on Monday, and those are just the ones I can remember. Historical overview. From David Calhoun, Lecture 2 on New Testament History, a big picture grows. That's the mnemonic. Assyria in 722 BC took people living in the area of the northern 10 tribes captive. Now in Luke 2, you meet a lady who's Anna, and she happens to be from the tribe of Asher. Well, I thought that was one of the lost tribes. There are no 10 lost tribes. Not in the Bible, there aren't. In poorly exegeted history, there might be. They took people living in those areas, but guess what? People moved around. Now, if you look at the law of Moses, really you were supposed to marry within your tribe. God didn't want the tribes, the lands moving around. But they did, and people see an invading army, they might rush south of Jerusalem, try to get behind the big walls and stuff like that. In fact, in the New Testament, the 12 tribes that are scattered abroad, no, those don't represent the church. There are 12 tribes even today. We don't know what tribe we're from for the most part. Some people, if your name's Levine, you're a Levite. If your name's Cohen, you're a descendant of Aaron. Okay? But anyway, they took people living there captive and then moved in some Gentiles. Babylonia, okay, that's modern Iraq, also called Mesopotamia, between the rivers. That is 586 BC. They took the southern kingdom of Judah captive. Now there was more than one captivity, but that's the big one. They destroyed the temple and everything. Persia, which is modern Iran, 537 BC, they were sort of the big empire at the time. Remember Daniel 5, the handwriting on the wall. Okay, the Medes, who weren't as strong, and the Persians, who were stronger, they were able to take over Babylonia. A big picture grows. Now, Alexander the Great, he's the he-goat from the west in Daniel 8:5. He conquered the Persian Emperor Darius in 333 BC. Conquered Palestine or Judah, whatever you want to call it. Theology books use both. I know Palestine these days, it's almost a hot-button term. I'm going to do what the theology books do and call it whatever they call it. Anyway, in the summer of 332 BC, he conquered that area. He conquered Egypt in 332 BC. Remember, he went very fast. He's represented in the book of Daniel also by the leopard. And leopards are quick. I know a guy who was son of missionaries, and he was in Africa for 5 years. And he talks about a lion coming into the camp and how they had to shoot the lion. But at least they had time. The lion roared. He said if it was a leopard, it just would have attacked them. You wouldn't have had a warning. Leopards are quick. And Alexander the Great was very quick. He conquered the land all the way to the Indus River. He died June 10th, 323 BC at age 33, master of the largest empire in history. And he conquered the vast empire and spread Greek culture. That was Hellenization. He wanted people speaking Greek, and he wanted people adopting Greek customs. Even though he himself was a little controversial in starting to adopt certain Eastern customs. In the East, they tend more to deify their leaders and stuff like that. Anyway, the division of his empire, once he died, the kingdom split into four, and it's complicated history. Anytime you look into history, just look at what's happened in the U.S. in our lifetime. I mean, it would take you several lectures to explain everything. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing. It's not just it was neatly divided amongst four people. Not generals fighting each other and everything. But it is in Daniel 8:8. The most prominent of these generals were Antigonus. Mm-hmm. The Jews liked him. He controlled parts of Asia Minor, that's pretty much modern-day Turkey, the kingdom of Pergamon. Ptolemy took control of Egypt. I mean, eventually they had all these, a lot of fighting going on. His son Soter deported, some say 100,000 from Jerusalem to Egypt, and they kind of liked it. Remember, Alexandria, Egypt had a huge Jewish community at the time of Christ. Seleucus took control of the eastern territories, and Cassander ruled over Macedon and Greece. So the people that really dealt with Palestine or Judea, whatever, are the Syrian Seleucids and the Egyptian Ptolemies. These were Greeks, but this is the area that they ruled. Greek domination. After the death of Alexander the Great, June 10th, 323 BC, the Jews kept their religious freedom during the reign of the Egyptian Ptolemies. That was 320 to 198 BC. But under the Syrian Seleucids, and they ruled over that area, including Jerusalem, from 198 to 142 BC, the first religious persecution in history that we know about broke out. It's the first time that someone tried to stamp out Judaism as a religion. Now remember, Haman wanted to kill the Jews, but he wasn't against Judaism. And this was very unusual, because in those days the pagans, hey, I got my gods, you got yours, I'll take yours, the more the merrier, let's be on the safe side. And scholars these days will say, well, it was a result of the civil war between the Jews that they got involved. Maybe, maybe not. Anyway, we have to look at the end of the Zadokite priesthood. Now, and I'll explain what that is. Remember, Solomon set up, when Solomon took over, there's a priestly line from Zadok. Onias III was a Zadokite priest. He was the last to become high priest through inheritance. Remember, you were a priest because your father was a priest, especially high priest. Jason, his name was Joshua. He changed his name to Jason, which is a Greek thing to do. Yeah. So you had this huge culture clash going on. He was Onias III's brother. Antiochus Epiphanes was a Syrian Seleucid, now in control of land, and he bribed him for the high priesthood. That is simony. Because remember that in Acts, Simon wanted to give Paul money to be able to perform miracles and stuff. And simony is basically buying priestly or religious office, ecclesiastical office. It goes back a way. Now, but at least he was sort of from that Zadokite line. Menelaus offered more money for the priesthood. to Antiochus. So he became the priest. He was a non-Zadokite priest. Remember, 1 Kings 2:27, Solomon had established the Zadokite line. So now you had non-Zadokite priests, you had civil authorities appointing high priests. This happened in the days of the Greeks, it happened in the days of the Romans. The high priest, Annas, Caiaphas, all that stuff, the Romans would put you in and take you out. That's not how God established it, but that's what happened. Life under the Seleucids. Antiochus IV, he called himself Epiphanes, which is God manifest. You change one letter in Greek and you get Epimanes, the madman. The Jews called him that behind his back. He was the king of the north in Daniel 11. By the way, it's interesting when you read Daniel, because we say, oh, it's the future. Everything in there just about has been fulfilled. And you can name the people. The collector of taxes, he's got a name. Okay? But Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, so it's like repeating. Some of these prophecies have dual fulfillments.
Right.
So, I mean, everything hasn't been completely fulfilled forever. But you can't just, I got saved after reading Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth. He talks about the king of the north, the king of the south. And you read this, it's historical. I mean, it might happen again. Jesus did say the abomination of desolation when you see this. But there is so much about Daniel. I heard a guy on the radio, he's talking about how many days, and he mentions, X number, if you translate the days into years, instead of X number of days, let's just say there are X number of years, you get, 1929 when the Vatican became an independent state, all kinds of stuff. There probably are several types of fulfillment. But if you get into typology, and you get into the parables, you see that. And the parables, unfortunately, probably, one source I read said, I'll use my own terminology, they've been short-shrifted since the Reformation. Because remember, the Reformation was a great revival in Augustinianism. And Augustine's the one, we call Calvinism today. Augustine brought that into the church. And basically, God's making all the choices. With the parables, the people are making choices, and God's not making it for them. So you can see why they were sort of ignored. I actually went online to a bunch of sites once. Or there's a site with a whole bunch of sermons. Okay, let's see if this is really true. Someone said that they haven't dealt enough with the parables in the last 500 years, whatever, since the Reformation. And I turn on a video, or it might have just been something you hear, okay? But it was on the internet. And the guy's mentioning something. He says, of course, it was in Matthew 25, I think. Of course, you can't take this literally. See, the problem is they don't. Well, that's that whole system of Calvinism and everything. It can't take things literally, or it would defeat itself. But anyway, that's one of the problems we've had. We don't understand the parables. We haven't done enough of them. We get a very surface understanding of them. But anyway, Antiochus IV, he desecrated the temple in 167 BC. He erected an idol altar on the altar of burnt offerings. He sacrificed the sow, and he sprinkled the temple with broth made of unclean flesh.
Wow.
Okay, again, why was he doing this? They'll say today he was involved in a Jewish civil war. He might have been. I mean, here's what happened. The Hellenization so split the people that you had, in the if there was a civil war, it was between the people in Jerusalem who were selling out to the Greeks and the people in the country who were more traditional and conservative, and they liked the old ways. But anyway, for whatever reason, I actually got stuff at home about different invasions and everything, very detailed. He came in and just tried to stamp out Judaism itself. Now, again, it was polytheism before that. The Jews, when the Babylonians invaded and destroyed the temple, how in the world did Daniel, years later, get to read from Jeremiah? The Babylonians didn't destroy, I don't think the Babylonians weren't out to destroy Judaism. And they let, Daniel says, I've been reading scripture and here's what's going to happen. And if you look at it, Jeremiah told the Jews, submit to the Babylonians. So the Babylonians treated them rather well. And I think the Babylonians knew, hey, his writings are in all these scrolls, so don't destroy the scrolls. That could have saved the Bible. But anyway, think of Operation Magic Carpet, 1948 or 1949, after the War of Independence, when they had to evacuate the Jews out of Yemen. I've read they walked like 200 miles, I think, in bare feet, carrying nothing but the Torah scrolls. And I've read interesting tidbits about that. People saw planes for the first time in their lives. One lady said, I was a girl, I'd never seen stairs before. In those days, you climbed upstairs to get to a plane before the tarmacs they have these days. And then they came to Israel and faced a certain prejudice because they were not always literate, they were backward, maybe didn't have the same sanitation. There's a whole issue in Israel when you talk about modern Israel about really the Ashkenazi Jews, the ones who came from countries where they were more educated and had more money, and the Sephardic Jews and the Mizrahi Jews, the so-called Arab Jews, that are coming from countries where they're much more backwards. And just the culture clash that exists in Israel, not that bad today, but I think it's still there a little bit. How did people respond to this? Parties evolved. This is during that intertestamental period. The Hasidim, which means pious ones. Now, don't think of today's New York, Williamsburg, New York Jews in the black suits. That started in the 1800s in Poland under a guy known as the Baal Shem Tov, master of the good name. It wasn't his real name. But anyway, it was an older group, and they wanted to keep the law the way it was supposed to be kept instead of selling out for Hellenization. The Pharisees probably evolved from that. They kept the law. Pharisees is from a root meaning to separate. The Sadducees accommodated Hellenization. They were sellouts to Greece and later to Rome. The Essenes placed spirituality above outward conformity. And then there were the Zealots who were fighters, especially during the siege of the temple, that ended in 70 AD, and even Masada and all that stuff later. So, this guy Jason, he built a gym in Jerusalem. A gym? Well, that showed, number one, is the Greek dominate. Number two, Greeks practiced in the nude.
Yeah.
No matter how many artist conceptions you see of the old Olympics, they did their stuff in the nude. So everyone could see if you've been circumcised. Antiochus outlawed circumcision, destroyed the Torah, forbade Sabbath observance, forced the Jews to eat pork, and stripped the temple of its treasures, besides, of course, basically making an altar, a temple to Zeus and everything, really defiling the temple. So you had these two cultures almost side by side. Hellenistic Jews. By the way, now you see the problem in the New Testament. What's the first problem the church had? Acts 6. The Grecian women said, we're not getting fed like Palestinian Jewish women are. The first problem was cultural. It was not theological. And what it was, then they took in Acts 6, 7 deacons, and they all had Greek names. To sort this out, you've got to see what's going on there, Stephen was the first martyr of the church. Guess besides Jesus and John the Baptist. Guess what? He had a Greek name. When everyone had to flee over Paul's persecution, it's interesting, the apostles got to stay. How did they stay when everyone else had to flee? Well, I think only a couple of them had Greek names, Philip and Andrew. That might have been part of the reason. They had Hebrew names. They could stay. they were probably used to hiding because they'd been with Jesus. They knew a little more about being underground. But there really was the persecution on the Grecians, which are Hellenistic Jews. It's actually a different word in Greek. You know, it says Grecians, I think in my King James Bible. It's not the same as the Greek. It's like a 1-2 letter difference. But there was this antagonism that had lasted for centuries. Well, a couple of hundred years by then. So anyway, Antiochus offered a pig on an altar to Zeus. That's the abomination of desolation. Temple worship was forbidden to the Jews, and he turned it into a temple to Zeus. Now, in Hebrews 11, you see a great chapter on faith. And what happens at the end of Hebrews 11, first of all, everything's in order, except there's one thing I think out of Judges where the order changes. But pretty much, it's in order. And then you get into stuff where people, today, Christians read it, oh, that's the Old Testament. It's probably the intertestamental period, starting in Hebrews 11, maybe 35b, okay? Which might refer to 2 Maccabees 6:11, 2 Maccabees 7, 2 Maccabees 8:6, and 10:6. It talks kind of in generalities, but it's probably, if it's really continuing in order, that's not Old Testament persecution, that's intertestamental period persecution that you see starting about halfway through Hebrews 11:35. Actually, I'm going to get, someone want to read that?
Yes, I have it.
Okay.
You want me to start at 35?
There, 35.
Okay. King James. Women received their dead, raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, sorry.
But notice, women received their dead to life, and you think of Elijah and Elisha, and then all of a sudden, others. It's very different. And when you read 2 Maccabees, you start to see what's probably going on there. A woman who had 7 kids of hers killed in front of her for not denying the faith. You know, not whatever they were supposed to do. On and on. I think she was killed also. So, they revolted. Okay, the first religious war in history. Again, here's what happened. The town of Modi'in, 167 BC, a Seleucid official ordered the villagers to sacrifice to the Greek gods. You know, they were forcing this Hellenization down their throats under Antiochus IV. There was a priest named Mattathias. He was outraged. You know, the villages are around. He killed a Jew that stepped up to do that. And he also killed the Seleucid official. This is revolt. Okay? Now, he had 5 sons. Not in this order, unless it's sheer coincidence. Yeah. Judah, Simon, John, Jonathan, and Eleazar. And don't say Eleazar. That's, you know, in Eleazar, the second E is silent. It's just how it's transcribed into English. But anyway, Judah was the first big leader. It was a guerrilla war. They were just sick of this. The temple had been defiled, and, you know, they were trying to, and what Judah, they call him the Maccabee. There are different theories as to why. It's probably because it means the hammer. He was a guerrilla, he fought a guerrilla war. Okay, probably no one here's been to Vietnam. Guerrilla war. We couldn't win it. We lost. Okay? Guerrilla wars are tough to fight. And these 5 brothers, they all died violently. Mattathias, I don't know how I can't find out how he died, but apparently it was not in war. He just died. The old man that started this, okay, his 5 sons really, got the revolt going. He did first, I guess. Mattathias died peacefully, and then Judah led the revolt, okay? But he did die apparently peacefully. Originally Judah, he was the priest, and the 3rd son of Mattathias was the Maccabee. But later the name Maccabee spread to his brothers, and even to the whole dynasty. So you got Judah the Maccabee, and then you got, they'll say Simon Maccabee. I mean, they all actually had different names, last names. But, they'll say, or Jonathan the Maccabee. The name just spread to a whole movement. Okay? It's, like if you identify with a particular leader in a movement, you might be called by his name. So it was applied to the Hasmoneans. Now, Hasmonean, that was a family patriarch. Hasmon. So that name kind of stuck too. They usually call it the Hasmonean dynasty. Sometimes they call it the Maccabean dynasty. I don't think I've seen too much. Hasmonean dynasty. Now they were John Gotti, John, Simon, also often called Simon the Maccabee, Simon Thassi, Judas Maccabeus. Now that's Latin, and it's a particular music piece, had to do with some war over in the British Isles or something. Okay, Judas. But anyway, this is a song or something. I forget exactly what it is. Eleazar Avaran and Jonathan Aphis, whatever. Now here's what I did last time I presented on the Maccabees. I spent way too much time on this. But John, there were 3 people with that name in the New Testament. Of course, the angel says, Gabriel, Zechariah, you're going to name your son John. Judah, it's also Judas, and it's also Judah. It's all the same thing. Okay. In Hebrew, they don't have 3 names. There's Yehuda. So it comes out as Judas in the New Testament because it has to go through the Greek, and Greeks tend to put S's in the names. Like, Elijah becomes Elias, Elisha becomes Elisus, Hezekiah becomes Hezekias, Jeremiah is Jeremias, on and on. And Yeshua becomes Jesus. Now, the thing is, there's only one word in Hebrew and there's one word in Greek. Okay? But you have Judah, Judas, it's all the same thing. It just depends what language it's coming through, which testament you're reading. And Jude. Now, why in the world did they name that little letter the Epistle of Jude? The reason I read was so that you wouldn't confuse them with Judas Iscariot. Okay? And I looked up St. Jude. I hear the St. Jude's Hospital. In my Hebrew name, when I was circumcised, I was given a Hebrew name that is not on my birth certificate. And it's Yehuda. Named after a woman named Judith, Yehudit. And, or Yehudis, as they'd say in that Ashkenazi Hebrew, or Yiddish. And I guess my mother said there were other people named after the same lady. But I looked up St. Jude. He's the patron saint of lost causes. It's something else.
Yep.
It's like, thank you for that. But there are 6 in the New Testament. Eleazar, which in the New Testament is Lazarus. Okay?
So Lazarus is the Greek of that.
Yeah, Lazarus is the Greek. 2 men with that name. Jonathan, not in the New Testament.
Right.
See, what I did before is I went, if you look at you would think they're naming their kids in New Testament times after the 12 sons of Jacob. But apparently, just from the limited data we have, what's in the New Testament, they're really naming kids after the Maccabees. Jesus had 2 half-brothers, Judah and Simon. What were his parents thinking? In case this guy doesn't pull it off, maybe they can. No, I'm serious. It's like, it was a common name. Judas, or Judah, it's all the same. Oh, and Simon, which is Simeon in the Old Testament, same name, Shimon. You ever hear of like Shimon Peres when you listen to news and Israel comes on, okay? It's all the same thing. It just depends what language you're speaking. They're kind of the two most famous. Jonathan also turned out to be quite a fighter. But First Maccabees speaks glowingly of these two brothers, more so than of the other three.
Yeah.
Now, and Eleazar especially, in a battle, the Syrians use war elephants sometimes. So in a battle, he sees this huge elephant, and he figures the king's on it, or the leader, whatever. He goes to spear it, take down the elephant with a big shot on top, and ends up crushing him. There's a famous Doré Bible illustration showing him come up under that. Gustave Doré, I think it's 241 Bible illustrations, including the Apocrypha. He was Catholic. And but he is not spoken of as glowingly. And you got to think, here's Jesus. He says, Simon, your name's Peter. Okay? And you understand that Petros, the rock and all that, upon this rock I will build my church. Maybe Jesus was saying something else too. Simon, you're named after a fighter. You're not going to do this. Put the sword up. He that picks up the sword will die by the sword. That's what he had to tell him. Simon was probably the biggest fighter. There was another guy who was a zealot. Maybe that was part of the reason Jesus gave him that name too. Some of the things that happened is all these battles, okay? Emmaus. Remember, the word Emmaus comes up in the Bible.
Yeah.
But let's see what it was back in the New Testament. Let's see what it was. Not in the Old. Let's see what it was here. There's a Seleucid base camp at Emmaus. It was flat, didn't have hills around it. Remember, the Maccabees would live in the mountains, come down, strike, get out. Guerrilla warfare. Mm-hmm. Okay? Viet Cong, Viet Cong, what was tricky was they just lived among everyone else, My father-in-law was showing me 35 millimeter slides when he was in Vietnam of his base being attacked by the Viet Cong. I said, of the locals, I said, I thought they were rice farmers. He says they were rice farmers by day and Viet Cong by night. Mm-hmm. But guerrilla war, it's when you're outnumbered, you're outgunned, they're outsorted, okay? You attack and get out and hide again. Interestingly, because the Maccabees did this a lot, when Menachem Begin, the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, National Military Organization, also called the Irgun for short, or in Hebrew acronym Etzel. Hebrew loves acronyms. They were fighting the British. They were trying to get the British out, in the 1940s. Mm-hmm. And Begin wrote his book called The Revolt, and it's been translated into English, which I've read twice. He says, people thought we were like that, living in the hills like the Maccabees. He said, we weren't. We were living in our homes. He would live in his home. When the British came looking for me, he actually had an underground thing he'd hide in. And he said his dog Roxy didn't like the British. She'd tear off the roof. Bark and bark, and the British are looking for these freedom fighters, and whatever you want to call them. Some people call them terrorists. There were three groups that were three Jewish paramilitary groups. The Haganah, which is defense, that eventually at times cooperated with the British, going after the other ones. The Irgun split off from them, and the CERN group split off from the Irgun. And there's all a history to that. But he said, they didn't. But the Maccabees did. They hid in the hills. So the Seleucids are camped where there aren't hills. They can't be surprised. By the way, Valley Forge, can you think of a dumber place to build a fort than in a valley?
Yeah.
When I first heard this in U.S. history in college, those weren't the professor's words, but, it's a terrible place to build a fort. But anyway, I guess you'd have water in a valley. Judah and his troops were encamped at Mitzpah, north of Jerusalem. Now the Seleucid Gorgias, whatever they pronounce that, he wanted to attack Judah at night. Judah left Mitzpah to attack the forces left at Emmaus. In other words, some of the forces left Emmaus, okay? So it's like a crisscross. Gorgias wants to hit Mitzpah in Judah, and Judah wants to hit Emmaus. instead of a direct confrontation with Gorgias, he goes, because there's some people at what they call an expeditionary camp still left that weren't, so you got a group going over to attack Judah, okay, and Judah's people go at night to attack the camp and anyone that was left behind at the camp. So they didn't even meet each other. Gorgias finds Mizpah deserted. So then he returns to his camp in Emmaus and finds that destroyed. They actually were able to drive out the people that were living there, or kill them, whatever. And Gorgias left for the coastal plains rather than engage the rebels. Now there's more to it, to this battle, but the thing is, we think of typology as Old Testament type fulfilled in the New Testament. Behold the Lamb of God which taketh away the sins of the world. Okay?
Right.
There is Old Testament typology fulfilled in the Old Testament. Here is Abram in Genesis 12 being thrust out of Egypt with great wealth. Well, in Exodus 14, same thing. Moses and millions are leaving Egypt, being thrust out with great wealth. Jesus is talking to a woman at the well at Samaria. I'm thirsty. 6th hour. At the 6th hour on the cross in the book of John, I thirst. There's
wow.
New Testament fulfilled in the New Testament. There's a lot of that. Okay?
Beautiful.
There's a lot of that. This is historical or intertestamental typology fulfilled later. Okay? Here's what happens. In Luke 24, 13 to 35, the disciples were despondent. Their hero that they had followed for years is dead. Okay? No mistake about it. No, he didn't swoon and come back to life in the tomb.
Right.
The things liberals have to think of that when they don't want to believe the Bible. But there was a great victory. Okay? It's Luke 24, 13 to 35, in the road to Emmaus. When all is down, there was a great victory. Jesus revealed himself. And you can see that in Emmaus, the Battle of Emmaus. Judah had fewer troops, the weaponry wasn't up to, what the Syrians had, but through strategy, they won. And it's the same type of thing. Jesus, I had Catholic friends, good friends of mine. When I got saved, well, why did the Jews not believe in Jesus? And I mentioned the anti-Semitism, but of course that came later, church anti-Semitism. They were looking for a military hero because it had happened 200 years before.
Right.
Okay? That's one of the things we have to watch out for. I have a friend in Illinois, and I talked to him on the phone. When Obama was elected, he said they went from 30 militias to 200. If I got those numbers right. Yeah, 30 militias to 200. People were ready to take on the government again, like it was the American Revolution. That's what we got to watch out for. We make the same mistakes the first century Jews made. It worked before, it's going to work again. We can stand up to the Romans. There were different false messiahs, military messiahs. Here's Jesus, they're putting their hope in, then he'll get rid of the Romans. And he doesn't. He gets himself killed. Okay? I know that there are people who are ready to take on the U.S. government again. Same mistake. But anyway, religious freedom was restored in 164 BC with a purification and rededication of the temple. They fought, and all 5 were eventually killed or assassinated, either in battle or assassination. But 164 BC, 3 years after the temple was desecrated, to the day, they were able to get it back. It was rededicated 3 years after. Now, we'll mention that some people say at 171 BC. I don't know what the historians are doing, if it's somewhat at different source or what. One thing is that the book I'm reading a book now. Now, actually, I just finished it this week. And it was written, it's great. It gets into the details, some of the details, but it's written like a high schooler, you know. It's all this copy and paste and copy and paste, and is he getting the names right? And it says John Hyrcanus, if I read this right, I kept reading it, was a son of Mattathias. No, he was a grandson of Mattathias. I mean, I don't think the guy gets his facts right all the time. But then you do see 171 BC. I don't know where that came from. The typical date they'll say is 164 BC. Oh, 167 BC was when the temple was defiled, but some people put it at 171. I don't know why. They rededicated. Okay, it's rededication, Hanukkah. Different ways of spelling it in English. Feast of Dedication, that's in John 10:22. It's less than 4 months before Jesus' death he went there. Or the Festival of Lights. Now, later on, you won't find this in any primary source, a legend arose that they had light for 1 day, enough oil for the light for 1 day, and it lasted 8 days. That's nowhere in 1 or 2 Maccabees. That came later. Like the bar mitzvah. It's not in the law of Moses, not in the Bible. It came later. Okay? Anyway, they were probably keeping a late Sukkot because they missed it, you know, and that's an 8-day holiday. It's believed that that's what they were doing. They went back to the temple and they missed Sukkot by a few months because the temple had been defiled. So they might have been keeping that, and then that somehow this myth of the oil came out. The century from 164 BC to 63 BC was the Maccabean or Hasmonean period. Here's what they did. They basically became kings and priests. Now the Bible, I know separation of church and state gets a bad name because of how people have used it in this country. It's just totally secularized the country. There is something like that in the Bible, okay? A priest could offer sacrifices. Kings couldn't. Remember Uzziah, he went in to offer incense and he was struck down with leprosy till his dying day. What's interesting is David with an ephod. He was a king. I mean, what's going on there? But basically, I mean, Moses we think of as a religious man, and he was. But Aaron, his brother Aaron, was the high priest, not Moses. You got to see that the Bible does have kind of a separation. It's just they're both under God. And what you have is these guys are now kings and priests, the same person, because they were from a priestly family as the dynasty went on. National sovereignty was restored under Simon. He was the last Maccabee to die, by the way. He was killed. 1 Maccabees 13:43, starting in 142 BC, the first time since the Babylonian captivity in 586 BC. It's the only time they had independence from 586 BC until 1948 AD. So we've got about 2,500 years of foreign domination with that brief period of around 70 or 80 years of political independence, actually 79 years. From 142 BC to 63 BC, the Jews are independent politically for 79 years. Now, the country was strong and independent, and nearly as large as at the time of David and Solomon. This probably fostered the spirit behind later uprisings, such as Masada in 70 to 73, or maybe 74 AD, and the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 and 135 AD. John Hyrcanus I, okay, he was the son of one of these guys. The Hyrcanus bit, I read this one place there's only one place I guess they use that particular name, Hyrcanus. They think they know where it comes from. We call him the first because later on there's a Hyrcanus II. He destroyed the Samaritan temple in 129 BC and the city of Shechem in 109 BC. He forcibly converted the Edomites to Judaism. That's something Jews hardly ever do. Forced conversions. I'm reading in the Inquisition now. That was wholesale in Spain. Jews don't forcibly convert people, but here's a time when they did. Hyrcanus the First. And that's why the Herodian dynasty was nominally Jewish, because Antipater, was part of that, and that was Herod the Great's father. It was Antipater 1 and Antipater 2, and then Herod the Great. But they expanded the empire, and they did forcibly convert people. Now, you took it, woman at the well. Jews didn't like going through Samaria. There was bad blood there. There was war in their background. It wasn't just, well, you're part Jewish and part Gentile from when the Assyrians deported a bunch of you and left the poorest there and brought in a bunch of Gentiles. There had been war. In fact, in 8 AD, the Samaritans went into the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and defiled it by throwing dead bones around. Okay? The rise and fall of the Maccabean dynasty. Now this is a quote from C.H. Dodd, the founder of Christianity, and I got this from Calhoun's notes. It began in the heroic resistance of the Maccabees, flourished for a time under their successors, the Hasmonean princes, and fizzled out in sordid squabbles among their last heirs when a Roman takeover became inevitable. Okay? Here's what happens. If you look at the United States, it's been all downhill in our history, generally. It started out great. Empires, if you look at Israel, ancient Israel, okay, the northern kingdom of Israel, of course, split from the southern kingdom. But the northern kingdom, the Bible says a lot about Saul. And yes, he had his failings, but he wasn't going around killing people. Actually, the problem was he wasn't killing some people he should, the enemies of God.
Right.
He was nothing like the ones that came later. And it says a lot about David and Solomon. And then it gets to where you get into 2 Kings, it's like you got a few, every chapter you got a new king or two. Just less and less said about the different kings as everything's falling apart. And of course, the northern kingdom, you had 19 kings under 9 dynasties. None of them were good, although one of them did talk to a prophet, to Elisha, the guy, shoot the arrow out there, and now strike the floor 3 times strike the floor with the arrows, and he strikes 3 times. You should have done it more. I mean, the guy knew the symbolism, It wasn't just symbolism, it was a statement. But the thing is, the Judean kings, you had some good ones, especially at the beginning. Jehoshaphat, Joash, Josiah later on. But basically it's getting worse and worse. That's the way things go. The Hasmonean dynasty was like that. It started out great, and it went downhill until it ended in a civil war. The Hasmoneans became kings and high priests, but it was not part of the Zadokite priesthood. And this started with Jonathan in 152 BC, and Queen Alexandra Salome, they did have a queen, she couldn't be the priest, the high priest. Now, here, Mattathias, the patriarch that started this fight, when he died, Judah took over, but actually, he apparently died peacefully. John, Simon, Judah, they didn't even spell it right. Eleazar. It should be Eleazar with an A. And Jonathan. Okay? Now, Simon had a kid, John Hyrcanus the First. Now, these aren't all the kids, Mattathias and Judah. John Hyrcanus the First had some kids, including Alexander Jannaeus. He had 2 key kids, Hyrcanus II, we call him, and Aristobulus II. No, this isn't Aristobulus I. It's the same thing with the Herodian dynasty. You get the first, we have to say Miriamne I, Miriamne II, because they were 2 successive wives of Herod the Great. So we say this first and second, even if they didn't back then. These guys are key to why everything fell apart. Oh, thanks. You're doing a good job with that, too. And we'll look at that in a second. Overview. Political strength made Rome. That's another one from Calhoun. The Ptolemies, the Seleucids, the Maccabees, and Rome. Okay, who was in control of that land at that time? The Ptolemies first, after Alexander the Great finally settled down. The Egyptian Ptolemies, the Syrian Seleucids, the Maccabees, and then Rome took over. So that's how you remember it. Political strength made Rome. Now, how did Jewish national sovereignty end? There was a civil war between brothers Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. They appealed to Rome. Even Judah was talking with Rome. I mean, Rome was not, it was an up-and-coming empire. And there's a complicated history with them in the Maccabees. But that Rome's getting stronger and stronger. And the Romans under General Pompey and the army of Hyrcanus II conquered Jerusalem and Aristobulus in 63 BC. He entered the temple and the Holy of Holies, which the Jews viewed as a desolation. But the thing is, Pompey found nothing in the Holy of Holies.
Right.
63 BC was the end of Jewish independence, end of the Hasmoneans, as far as rulers, and being in complete control, and beginning of Roman rule. The first client king was Hyrcanus II. Rome chose him. Two brothers fighting. Rome says, we want Hyrcanus II in. We're taking over now. We're putting him in. He was declared by the Romans as a legitimate successor. As far as political power goes, he was the last of the Hasmoneans. He ruled over Judah under the Romans. He was made an ethnarch. Now you had the Roman emperor, okay? Emperor, ethnarch, tetrarch, then your procurators, prefects. You see them in the New Testament. And high priest. He was a puppet of a puppet. The power behind Hyrcanus II was Antipater. He was the governor of Idumea, or Edom, which had become, which John Hyrcanus II, the first had conquered, so it was part of Judea. So the Romans really they liked Antipater, and they had their man there in Judea, and they put Hyrcanus under him. They wanted the weaker one because they could control him. Not that it ever happens these days. Idumea was a land south of Judah. It was conquered by John Hyrcanus I, so it's part of Judea. And the people of Idumea had been forced to convert to Judaism during the conquest of their land, so that technically they were Jews. Antipater played his politics well and got much power. Remember, he was allied with the Romans. The Romans trusted Antipater as their key man in Judea, and Hyrcanus II was a figurehead. The son of Antipater was Herod, known in history as Herod the Great. Again, Pompey figured that the weaker Hyrcanus would be a better ward of Rome than his brother, the stronger Aristobulus. This is Hyrcanus II, Aristobulus II. So the independent Hasmonean rule lasted until 63 BC, when the Roman general Pompey intervened in the Hasmonean Civil War, making it a client kingdom of Rome. And the dynasty really ended. And that's a sermon I gave. Ended in 37 BC when the Idumean Herod the Great became king of Israel, designated king of the Jews by the Roman Senate, effectively transforming the Hasmonean kingdom into the Herodian kingdom, a client kingdom of Rome. By the way, there are 3 people in the Bible named Herod, and there were 11 Herods. 3 of them were called Herod. And Herod Antipas, that executed John the Baptist and put Jesus on, it was actually, Pilate tried Jesus, but he sent him to Herod. He's called a king, but he was never a king. It was a popular title, an honorific title. Herod the Great was declared king by Rome.
Right.
Herod Antipas was a tetrarch, never rose above that. But he's called king in the Bible. I think 2 of the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
So Antipater, the father of Herod the Great, was a puppet of Rome with Hyrcanus II. In other words, Hyrcanus II was a puppet's puppet. Jewish national sovereignty. If you can get to the last slide. I've got it mapped out. I mean, there's so much more than this. You could teach a whole course on this. I mean, I got a book, 600 odd pages on the theology and the history, and there's a lot in there.
What's the name of that book?
I don't remember.
I'm fascinated. I'd like to read it.
I just got it from Amazon. What is it? I can't remember the name. I haven't even started reading it.
Sounds fascinating.
I can bring it to you. Yeah, go if you can get to the last. Okay, here. Now if you can stop it. And then, okay. The conquest of the promised land was about, now black is when the Jews possessed the land. Red is periods of dispersion. And yes, they weren't called Jews way back then, but 1440 BC, about that time, was the conquest. The first exile of dispersion, in Hebrew known as Galut. 722 BC for the northern kingdom, 586 BC for the southern kingdom. Return from Babylon, 538 BC. The Maccabees, okay, they cleansed the temple, 142 BC, they got political independence. Okay, in other words, they cleansed the temple, but they had religious independence. Eventually, Antiochus IV rescinded his ban on Judaism, by the way. But politically, the Maccabees, some people were satisfied. We get the temple back. Okay, and some people wanted to keep fighting, and so the Maccabees kept fighting. They got political independence in 142. Lost that in the Roman conquest because you just had these sordid squabbles, and Rome intervened. And then the second dispersion, 70 AD was when Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed. 135 AD was the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Most of the Jews were cleared out. Something I want to look into more after that, the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Christians, really cleared out the Jews, I've read. I've got to get more dates on that. By the way, as far as anti-Semitism, the worst church, as Westerners, we think, oh, the Roman Catholic Church with the Inquisition, the Crusades, they're nothing compared to the Orthodox.
Wow.
We just don't understand Eastern Christianity because most of us aren't from the East. If you're Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox, you might. And I have gone to Russian Orthodox Catechism, which was great. They deal so much with theology proper. But historically, like the Rome, they got icons 13 miles from here. They got icons in a Russian Orthodox church of Tsar Nicholas II. You know, the last Romanov,
Yep.
The one that was killed with his wife and 4 kids in the basement. And wait a minute, the Romanovs were sworn enemies of the Jews, but the Russians, if you think of not just the Khmelnytsky rebellion, with perhaps 100,000 Jews killed, 300 Jewish communities wiped out, but they can't tell exactly. But you look at 1903, the Kishinev pogrom. Now you got cameras, now you got interviews. Right? And Orthodox seminary students were raping Jewish women during that time and killing people and everything. The East has treated the Jews worse than the West has, because Roman Catholicism, you look at when the Nazis invaded Poland, some of the Poles hate the Jews. It can be a very anti-Semitic country. Some of them, I'm sure they were Catholics, hid the Jews at great risk to themselves.
Yeah.
Because if you were caught hiding Jews, your kids and your wife were killed in front of you, then you were killed. Not in Holland, by the way. You know, Anne Frank and all that. Because the Nazis just saw them as fellow Aryans. Even though they, after the bombing of Rotterdam, Dutch soldiers were surrendering and the Nazis killed some of them anyway. But there's a lot more hatred of the Orthodox Church against the Jews than there has been from the Catholic Church. Because Catholic Church nominally, officially, supports the Jews and often has. A lot of these inquisitions and stuff like that, stuff that gets out of hand, the Pope's not their dictator. Everyone thinks he is. No. The Pope is only considered infallible when he speaks ex cathedra. That's been twice in the last 2,000 years. Okay? Any Catholic, any priest is free to disagree. The Pope speaks of his opinion unless he's speaking ex cathedra. And both times they did that, 1800s and then I think 1950 something, or I forget, had to do with Mary. It was doctrine of Mary, assumption to heaven and all that. Catholics often, hide Jews in the monasteries from the Nazis and take great risks, but it's both ways. Some of them hate them,
Yeah.
I am reading now in the Inquisition. But that was as political as it was religious. But anyway, Jews were pretty much clear. There has always been Jews in certain cities in Jerusalem, even through all of that, or cities in Israel, even through all of that.
Mm-hmm.
First Aliyah, 1882 AD, when Jews started coming back. 1803, they probably started coming back as individuals. That's one date I've run into. 1882 or 1881, I see both dates, is when the first wave of immigration started. Now I found something about another wave before that, but it's not called the first Aliyah. I mean, history always gets so complicated. And then, of course, they get the Declaration of Independence now. But basically, that's an overview of what happened at the time of the Maccabees. They rose up in defiance of the Syrian Seleucids who were persecuting them, trying to make them not practice Judaism and killing them. And then then they got the temple back, and then some of them, people fought on to get political independence back. They had their religious independence, and then they went for full political independence, which they got. And then they started a dynasty of kings and priests. There's the same person, which isn't biblical, non-Zadokite priests, and a lot of reaction to everything going on. The Sadducees sort of selling out to whoever was in political power. The Pharisees. By the time of Jesus, the Pharisees were the synagogue people. They ran the synagogues and whatever. They were the party of the common people. The Sadducees were more elite, wealthier, probably fewer of them. They are the aristocracy. And the Essenes, we know some stuff about them, and the Zealots. But a lot of this really happened because of Hellenization. Alexander the Great started this whole thing. Okay, any questions?
Yeah, I don't really get it, because what I recall is in Malachi, the Jews they had more interest in building their houses than the temple, and why would sacrifices be necessary? Because after they returned back from exile, they didn't have a temple.
Yeah, but they built one.
Yeah, but what I was just getting at, though, they were more interested in their own houses than they were the temple. Yeah, they did build one. Of course, God had to send them a prophet. But he still would send this extraordinary prophet, Malachi, to examine his people, that they were not following at all the commandments of what they were giving by reading the Torah.
Well, first of all, that was before all this happened. This was hundreds of years before this. They were in control of, actually, they weren't completely in control. They were under Persians, and then, at that time. And they were there was a time when the people were becoming selfish, when they should have been building, the priesthood and the temple and all that, and weren't necessarily. They were concerned with survival and not putting God first. But there were, the times, it's like if you look in the Old Testament, the different kings of Judah, some are good, some are bad. Religious conviction returns under Joash and under Josiah, and it comes, it's like a tide, it comes and goes. Mm-hmm. So Malachi is talking to people, they kind of lost their convictions, and people, it doesn't mean everybody was involved with this, and it's probably a minority of the people.
That's what I, yeah.
Yeah, probably a minority of the population. I mean,
Right.
how many people really take up arms? And, maybe a minority of the people, and they're being severely persecuted and killed. Do not keep your religion. And that's when they started up, really, this has, gone on too far. Malachi was talking to people who, like us, sometimes, we start putting survival and comfort ahead of God. And that's what he was talking about. God wanted a temple. And the Maccabees are prophesied in Daniel is doing great exploits. And a lot of the details are in Daniel. I mean, some of them are really there. And they're praised in Daniel long before it happened. So they did the right thing. It's kind of like some people, I don't know, COVID hit, and you could see some churches defying the government, some churches capitulating. Okay, the COVID restrictions, and some threat of arrest. I think of MacArthur out in California. I think of Schaller and Greater Grace World Outreach in Baltimore saying, we're going to have service. That's that. Led by a guy who had been behind the Iron Curtain in the days when it was dangerous. I know him. And, so it's the same type of thing, We kind of go like this, we got revival and it peters out, in American history, we've got revival and then it sort of peters out, and revival and it peters out. So where were the people back then?
You'd say the same thing about the American Revolution too. Not everybody fought for the revolution. A lot of people didn't fight. It was like that in some sense. I mean, there were a lot of people, there was a minority who fought, but there was a lot of people who just were like, great, good for you, keep on doing the good work, I've got things I've got to do. Bye.
A bunch of them left for Canada. They were loyal to the crown.
Right.
It wasn't all the Americans, it was a minority.
It was a very small
It was a
minority.
civil war, really.
Yeah, it was. It really was.
And this is something I intend to learn the details. It's going to take me years to learn them. Because here's the reason. The Bible is the Word of God, okay? And when you deal with Maccabees, some people will say, well, some of the, there's a little bit of contradictory stuff. The numbers might be inflated, whatever. But pretty much we know what happened. Here's the thing. History is not Old Testament and then history stops. Not even Jewish history, and then New Testament, and then that stops.
Right.
Right now, you could say we're in the Third Testament, the church age. But it's continuous, and it starts in the Old Testament, and it goes through this time, even as related to the children of Israel, the Jews, whatever you want to call them. And it continues. And it's continuous, and that's our problem, is we start thinking, okay, Luther reacted to some Catholic beliefs. They get their teaching magisterium. I don't even think papal infallibility was around at Luther's day. It was conciliar infallibility. Okay? But, and then we say sola scriptura. Well, that's all the Bible. That's how we set our theology. But that's not everything. If you are alive when Jesus was, you knew all these things. Just like we know, we had a revolution, we had a civil war, War of 1812, and then the Civil War, and World War I, and the Depression, and World War II, and Korea, and Vietnam, and good night. I can't even keep up with the ones we've had in the last 20 or 30 years now. And what's really interesting is if you talk to people who have been in the military, there were places that the history and the government isn't talking about.
Right.
I've been in places because I've talked to people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
They don't tell you.
No.
But anyone in Jesus' day would have known all this. So the Bible doesn't have to say it was this Herod or it was that Herod. They knew which Herod you're talking about. Okay. They knew all that. So if we know a lot, and I get another presentation on the Herods, but I'm not going to do it now, Well, I'd have to go, I'm not going to do it now. But you get to understand what the people in the first century understood, and then you're looking at the New Testament in living color. and not just black and white with some red letters. That's the point. That in original culture, the history they knew, original languages, their habits, women waiting for a bridegroom, they don't know when he's coming and he comes at midnight. I mean, we don't do that these days. We know when the wedding's going to start.
Right.
You have to see that the way they saw it. But this is part of it. This is, I think, one of the reasons the Sadducees and the Pharisees were both corrupt.
Yeah.
Okay? And I think it was Ironside's book. He mentions, it is. He mentions how it affected Jewish thought. Okay? The Pharisees became very legalistic. The Sadducees were liberal. And so by the time Jesus was around, you never noticed Jesus only had one meaningful exchange with the Sadducees?
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
He argued with the Pharisees because they at least believed the Word of God.
Right.
Right.
Sadducees, yeah,
Liberals.
Right.
yeah.
Basically.
And actually you argue more with people you're closer to.
Right.
That is why some people say Jesus was a Pharisee. No, he wasn't, but at least he had someone to talk to. The Sadducees weren't even that interested.
Right. He could
Right.
at
To the
least
last
relate
minute.
to the Pharisees. And he
Yeah,
couldn't even relate
they were
to the
talking law.
Sadducees. Yeah.
They were talking law. And
I read recently the Sadducees denied, they didn't even believe in any kind of afterlife or eternal life. Is that true?
That's the
yeah,
Sadducees.
no, the
Right.
Sadducees did.
Yeah.
Now the Pharisees, when it talks about washing hands, to eat with unwashing hands defileth not a man.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what were washing hands back then? What they would do is they would try to emulate the temple priests, which they weren't supposed to be doing. I've read in one of Ederstein's books exactly how they would do it with their hands in the temple, and the people would wash their hands like that as if they're priests. I'll bet you that's where the yarmulke comes from. Okay, the yarmulke. When I was a kid, well, I think it was my mother told me we know there's something above us. Okay, well that probably came later. Where did it come from? A book I've got is the Jewish Book of Why and the Second Jewish Book of Why. I've got those both. Alfred Koltach or something like that. And he says that they were yarmulkes because Christians had to pray without the men supposed to pray with their heads uncovered, so the Jews covered their heads. Yeah, that's his explanation. My guess is they were trying to be like the priests in the temple. Okay? And I mean, even with unwashing hands, first of all, when I was a kid, I never washed my hands before I ate, and it never did me any bad anyway. Biologically, I'm a PhD chemist. I've taken 4 courses in biology, 3 in biochemistry. You go to the table without washing your hands, unless you've really been into something, like you're mucking the barn, you're not going to hurt anybody. But also, it was a particular religious habit, okay? And he's not even talking sanitation there, really.
It was a ritual.
It was a ritual.
Right. Clean
Okay,
hands.
when I go home for a funeral or something, they'll have a bowl of water outside the house and you have to dip your hands in and wash your hands before you go in the house. What Jews do these days is after a funeral, you go back for a big feed. You walk in the house and feast. It's true. And more than others. And I remember a Christian on Christian radio saying, something about going in and said there's mountains of tuna fish, and I've seen this myself, but you can't get a drink. Someone that wanted one stiff drink or something couldn't get it. Jews don't drink a lot. Some restaurants don't like them because they make their money off alcohol. By the way, McDonald's makes it on sodas, which hardly cost them anything, and fries. They don't make it on the burgers. When I first worked for McDonald's, I was told that. I was told specific numbers. It's probably still true. The Jews are not big drinkers, except we do this thing in the prison called the strong arm. It's a 12-page interview, and then you put the results in a computer. And probation and parole uses the results and everything. And you have to ask an inmate, when's the first time you had a drink, alcohol? Good night, if I ever had to do that. Because wine is given to us, Shabbat meals, Hanukkah, Passover. Even as a little kid, they'll give it to you. So I'd probably have to say 4 years old. And then this would go, alcohol problem his entire life or something is how it translates into the strong R report. Anyway.
Yeah, that wouldn't look good on paper.
Yeah. Anything else, or should I turn it off? And the usual disclaimer, I'm not the Apostle Paul, I'm not Jesus. Some of what I said might not be true, and I'm just doing my best to get accepted dates.
Right.
We're historians, we can't even set our calendars right to this day, probably. So, but it's generally understood these things happen at specific times. And anyway, okay, I'm going to turn this off.
Yay, that was good.
It was good.
Yeah, that was
Thanks for
very good.
control for that.
Thank you.
I feel like I audited a